How one leader's fear reshaped an entire nation. It did not begin with cruelty or ambition, but with fear quietly settling into power. One decision followed another. Each meant to protect control rather than serve the future. And slowly, an entire nation changed direction. This story matters today because leadership driven by fear rarely announces itself as such. It disguises caution as strength and control as responsibility, reshaping institutions long before consequences are visible. Fear in power is particularly dangerous because it mimics the appearance of decisive governance, making it difficult for citizens to distinguish between a leader who is protecting them and one who is protecting only themselves. At the time, the leader faced mounting pressure, internal unrest, economic uncertainty, and a constant threat of losing authority in a fragile political environment. Every challenge felt existential, turning compromise into risk and openness into danger. The political landscape offered no safe ground, as rivals exploited every hesitation, and allies demanded reassurance that control was firm. In this atmosphere, even routine governance began to feel like crisis management, and the distinction between genuine threats and imagined ones blurred until every disagreement looked like an existential challenge. Instead of confronting uncertainty, the response was consolidation. Power was centralized, dissent reframed as instability, and loyalty rewarded more than competence. Advisors who offered honest assessments were gradually replaced by those who confirmed existing fears, narrowing the information reaching leadership and deepening the isolation that fear itself had created. At first, the changes seemed reasonable. Order improved, opposition quieted, and supporters praised decisiveness in a period of anxiety. But fear does not stop once control is secured. It demands reinforcement, repetition, and expansion. Each measure taken to secure power revealed new vulnerabilities that demanded further measures, creating a cycle where control was never sufficient and security was always temporary. Policies hardened, institutions narrowed, and flexibility vanished as stability became dependent on obedience rather than trust. What began as protection was quietly transforming into limitation, and the nation would soon discover how deeply fear had reshaped its future. As control tightened, fear began shaping policy more than evidence, as decisions prioritized loyalty and predictability over innovation and accountability. Institutions that once balanced power were weakened, their independence framed as risk rather than safeguard. Courts, legislatures, regulatory bodies, and independent media were gradually brought under the influence of centralized authority, not always through direct suppression, but through appointment, funding decisions, and the quiet marginalization of dissenting voices within those institutions. Public discourse narrowed as criticism was associated with disloyalty, encouraging silence instead of debate. The range of acceptable opinion contracted, and topics that once generated healthy disagreement were treated as settled, not because consensus had been reached, but because questioning had become costly. Economic choices favored short-term stability over long-term resilience, reinforcing dependence on centralized authority. Investment was directed toward projects that demonstrated the leader's control rather than those that would build lasting capacity. And the economy became increasingly dependent on state direction rather than independent enterprise. Supporters accepted these shifts as necessary, believing restraint would prevent chaos and preserve national unity. But the system became fragile because stability built on fear requires constant reinforcement. Every success had to be attributed to the leader's vision. Every failure had to be blamed on external enemies or internal traitors. The narrative demanded perfection, and perfection is unsustainable. Talented individuals withdrew or adapted, reducing creativity and competence within leadership and administration. Those with the skills and independence of mind to challenge poor decisions either left the country, retreated into private life, or learned to perform loyalty while withholding their best judgment. The result was an administration that appeared unified but was intellectually hollowed out. The nation appeared calm, but was becoming rigid, unable to absorb shock without breaking. Fear had achieved control, but at the cost of adaptability. And the deeper it embedded itself, the harder it became to reverse. The conflict intensified when external and internal pressures collided, exposing how little resilience remained beneath the surface of control. The system had been optimized for predictability, not adaptability. It could handle routine challenges efficiently, but struggle when faced with anything unexpected. Economic strain, social dissatisfaction, and global shifts tested a system designed to suppress uncertainty rather than manage it. The rigidity that had once appeared as strength now prevented the nation from responding effectively to challenges that required flexibility, creativity, and decentralized decision-making. Problems that neighboring nations addressed through collective adaptation became crises because a fear-based system could not tolerate the openness and experimentation that adaptation requires. Each challenge was met with tighter restrictions, reinforcing the cycle that had created the vulnerability in the first place. The leader interpreted every setback as evidence that control needed to increase, not that the approach itself was flawed. This feedback loop between fear and control accelerated, consuming resources, alienating allies, and deepening the isolation of leadership from the realities facing ordinary citizens. Public trust eroded as citizens sensed that stability was maintained through force and fear rather than shared purpose. The gap between official narratives and lived experience widened, and while open dissent remained dangerous, private skepticism spread through every level of society. People complied publicly while doubting privately, creating a society where official consensus masked widespread disillusionment. The buildup reached its peak when a major crisis demanded flexibility, transparency, and cooperation, qualities the system had systematically weakened. The crisis required exactly the kind of distributed decision-making, honest assessment, and adaptive response that fear-based governance had spent years dismantling. The institutions that might have managed the crisis effectively had been weakened. The talent that might have found solutions had left or been silenced. The trust that might have sustained collective effort had eroded. What once seemed like strength now revealed itself as brittleness, as centralized control struggled to respond to complexity. Fear had shaped the nation into something efficient but fragile, orderly yet unprepared. The leader's initial insecurity had become a structural weakness affecting millions. This was the moment when the cost of fear became undeniable, and the nation stood on the edge of reckoning. The climax arrived when the system finally cracked under pressure it could no longer suppress, revealing that fear-based control cannot adapt indefinitely. What was built to prevent loss of power instead magnified vulnerability. The very mechanisms designed to insulate leadership from challenge also insulated it from reality, and when reality could no longer be ignored, the system had no capacity to respond. The resolution is not that caution is wrong, but that fear-driven leadership trades resilience for obedience. A nation shaped by fear may appear stable, but struggles to evolve when conditions change. The lesson is not that leaders should ignore threats, but that responding to threats by concentrating power and silencing dissent creates vulnerabilities far greater than the ones it claims to address. True security comes not from the elimination of challenge, but from the capacity to meet it, and that capacity depends on openness, diversity of thought, and institutional independence, all of which fear systematically destroys. This story matters today because fear remains one of the most powerful forces in governance, often disguised as responsibility or protection. History shows that societies thrive not when fear is eliminated, but when it is prevented from ruling decisions. The distinction is critical. Acknowledging threats is not the same as allowing those threats to dictate every response. Wisdom lies in recognizing when fear is guiding action and having the discipline to resist its pull toward control. The future of any nation depends on leadership that can confront uncertainty without retreating into control. Governance that answers fear with openness rather than restriction builds a resilience that fearful leadership destroys. The challenge is that openness feels dangerous in moments of genuine threat, and the courage to remain open when fear counsels closure is rare and precious. Fear reshaped this country, but awareness can prevent repetition elsewhere. The pattern is recognizable, and recognizing it is the first step toward resisting it. Subscribe to join the journey. How